Riddle Me That is a true crime podcast that deals with adult themes. Some episodes explore disturbing topics such as murder, abuse, sexual violence, drug abuse, suicide, and self-harm. Please listen at your own risk. Theories discussed in episodes may not be the opinion of the host.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Jules, and this is Riddle Me That True Crime. So I'm so excited today because I'm welcoming Caprice from the Unseen podcast back to the show. Welcome, Caprice.
Hi, Jules. Excited to be back on the show.
Caprice and I covered the mysterious death of Rebecca Corium, who was working aboard the Disney Wonder cruise ship a while back. So if you haven't listened to that, definitely go and listen. For those who haven't heard the episode and don't know Caprice, do you want to tell my listeners a little bit about your podcast and what got you started podcasting?
Yeah, of course. My podcast is called The Unseen, and it focuses on UK true crime, missing people, and unsolved and older cases that have gone cold. First started the podcast in 2017 because I'd always been interested in true crime and found myself listening to podcasts, which were all as a result of Serial, which I think is a reason that a lot of us got involved with podcasts in the first place. There weren't tons of UK true crime podcasts then. They were just a couple. And I was inspired to cover unsolved cases and missing people because they're the cases that I'm attracted to most.
So I just need your opinion. Do you think that Adnan Syed is guilty or innocent?
Innocent.
Serial, the way that they kind of portrayed things, I kind of left thinking it could go either way. But hearing subsequent information, I'm more inclined to believe that he's innocent as well.
After listening then, went on from Serial to listen to Undisclosed and then to listen to Bob Ruff and Truth and Justice and all the things they kind of uncovered on those subsequent podcasts. I'm completely think that Adnan's innocent. I know it's a divisive thing and some people really think that he's guilty and then there are people that really think he's innocent and it's quite a controversial one, but I think he's innocent.
Yeah, I'm definitely leaning far more towards the innocent side with regards to Adnan. It is one of those cases where people are very married to their opinions one way or the other.
Definitely. There's lots of opinions out there, I think, about Adnan.
Serial was such a great podcast, though, because it's one of the first ones I ever got into as well. And it was just so captivating. Like every episode, you're pulled deeper into this story. It was fascinating.
It is. And, I'd never listened to podcasts before, like just in general, never listened to it. And my husband said, there's this podcast I've been listening to and you'll really, really like it. And I was a bit skeptical. I was like, oh, don't really know whether I like podcasts or not. And then after that, I'm just hooked completely. So never went back.
That's so funny that he's the one that got you into podcasts.
Yeah. He listened to them before. He'd listened to them for years and it just wasn't something that I was kind of into. And then, after Serial, just podcast, listen to another one. And then I had millions on there and it was all down to him really.
So we've spoken about this before, but I think it's a really interesting question because I get asked this all the time and I suspect that you do as well. But what is it about unsolved cases versus solved cases that just really kind of draws you towards them?
I just feel like they need more attention because I'm always sad when they get forgotten about for more new and recent cases. And I get that those are the ones that often can be solved because there's new evidence and things like that. But it just feels like the unsolved cases, they deserve more media attention. And for me, I find them the most interesting because there's lots of unanswered questions. And I find it fascinating to kind of research and try and figure out what's going on with them.
Yeah, I agree. It's just some people really love an end. They like a resolution. They like a conclusion to a story. But I'm the same as you. For some reason, I feel like these cases need more awareness brought to them. And oftentimes there's families attached to these that are suffering. So if you can, maybe give them more exposure in some way and hopefully tell the story in a way that is respectful to the family, which you always do. You present the facts in a very unbiased way and you're always, very above board with that stuff. So I'm sure anytime the family listens to your podcast, they're very pleased with your presentation of facts. So, it is gratifying when you do hear that people either close to the victim or the family has listened to what you put out there and they are happy with it. I think that's like the best feeling there is.
Yeah. And, it's happened a few times. And, I think they're just happy that, a lot of the times when I've spoken to families in a lot of the cases, they are old cases and they do feel like there probably won't ever be a resolution. But I think it's the fact that somebody cares enough to talk about them that kind of makes them feel like there's hope. And I think if you don't talk about them, they're never going to get solved, because a lot of them that happened in the 60s, 70s, they didn't have DNA, they didn't have CCTV. There isn't going to be like a smoking gun. It might only be somebody saying one thing that they didn't think was important off the back of hearing about it that will solve it. So I think if you don't talk about them, then they're definitely never going to be solved.
Also, like there's also that element at play where the more you talk about a case that may never get solved, but you're giving a kind of justice and that you're writing that individual into history, the more you speak about the case and the injustice, they're not being forgotten. It isn't justice in the classical sense, but the fact that this person will be remembered and what happened to them will be continually brought up again and again as I guess we make it part of an oral history because we're speaking about it on podcasts. And I think there's something special about that, in that we're continually saying the name of somebody that a family member without that may feel like they could be forgotten and lost to time.
Definitely, yeah. And I think a lot of the media attention that they got was right at the beginning, for the first 2 weeks maybe, of the person going missing or the murder, and then after that, nothing. So for all these years, they've not been able to kind of search for the name and find anything about them. It's as if they didn't exist. So you're right. I think it's important to talk about them, and that just will help, I think, definitely help the families.
So I'm not going to make Caprice kind of answer all my usual questions because she did that last time. But for those of you who missed the last episode, it's basically Claudia Lawrence that is the one case that you'd love to see resolution to, correct?
Yeah, definitely. Especially now that her dad died recently, and, he was the one advocate for Claudia that kept putting it out there in the media. So I really hope she doesn't get forgotten about.
I really feel strongly about Claudia's case as well. And I think it's 100% solvable. And I truly believe that the police know who did it. They just need either somebody to come forward with more information or they need more evidence.
Yeah, I think it's clear that the police, in a lot of the things that they've put out there, they've basically said, we know who it is, we just need them to come forward. And they've really been putting pressure on people in the local community. So I think they do have an idea. It's just they haven't got the evidence to back it up, or that they're not quite there with the evidence yet to be able to publicly say anything.
So I've been going through Caprice's back catalog, and when I listened to her coverage on this case, I knew that we had to do another collaboration. So do you want to tell my listeners a little more about what they can expect from this series?
Yeah, in the next few episodes, we're going to be focusing on the unsolved murder of TV presenter and journalist Jill Dando in 1999. It's a case that's been suggested. It was suggested to me lots of times before I covered it, but the story touched the hearts of millions in the UK because Jill Dando was a famous figure, was well loved on TV, and therefore her death shocked everyone. And the fact that it's still unsolved also has lots of people baffled. So we're going to delve into the story of her life, what happened to her, the investigation, and what has happened since in the episode. For this episode, I've researched and used the book All About Jill, The Life and Death of Jill Dando by David James Smith, amongst other sources. It's a very thorough book written by him with support from Jill's family, if anyone would like to have a look at it after listening to the episodes. This episode does contain descriptions of violence, so please use your own discretion when listening to it.
This is seriously one of those cases that I'm absolutely transfixed by, because there has obviously, Caprice and I are covering it, so it's unsolved, but there's just been no resolution. And it feels like every link and every suspect is so tenuous. And you will all come to understand that if you're unfamiliar with the case up till this point. But on that note, Caprice, take it away.
Jill Dando was born on the 9th of November 1961 to parents Herbert Jack Dando and Winifred Mary Jean. Her parents were known to many simply as Jack and Jean. She was born in Weston-super-Mare, which is a town sat on the seaside in the county of Somerset. It's known for tourism due to its seaside location and its connection to culture, being a setting for musical festivals over the years, and also being the location of the artist Banksy's art installation, Dismaland, in 2015. In 1961, however, when Jill was born, Weston-super-Mare was not known for this, and it was for the most part a sleepy seaside town. Known in its time for its therapeutic spa facilities, which were made popular during the Victorian era, Weston-super-Mare still had the image of a typical English seaside town.
Yeah, so this sounds like just a really lovely, idyllic place. Is this kind of somewhere, like when I think of seaside places in England, I think of Brighton. Is it something like that?
Well, I've never actually been to Weston-super-Mare, but I've been to places which will be similar. And yeah, I imagine so. Brighton's a bit more, I don't know how to describe. It's quite an expensive place to live, Brighton, and, but it is a similar type of environment, a typical kind of seaside. You can go and get fish and chips, go on the fair and the piers and that kind of thing, yeah.
So is this like a middle class area that Jill grew up in?
Yeah, I'd say so, yeah. I think she was from quite a middle class family, yeah. So Jill's parents, they'd settled in Weston-super-Mare, and Jill's father Jack was working in the print room of the local newspaper, the Western Mercury as it was known then, and Jill's mother was a homemaker. When Jill was born, the family already had a son, Nigel, who was 9 at the time of their second child's birth. Jill's birth was complicated from the beginning as she was born with a heart condition, a blocked valve and a hole in her heart. Her health was not guaranteed in 1961 as heart surgery was not at the same level that it is today. But to everyone's relief, she pulled through and became much healthier and more robust in her older years.
Wow, that is a really serious thing for a child to be born with. And her brother is so much older. So I bet you this family just kind of rallied around her as like this miracle baby who pulled through having open heart surgery or whatever as an infant. That's crazy.
Yeah. And I think, to be honest, by the sounds of Jill's later life, it was, she was quite resilient and quite, she was kind of dedicated to doing what she wanted to do. And it probably was a result of what had happened to her when she was younger. But the family lived happily in Jill's younger and adolescent years, and she progressed well in school, entering sixth form college age 16 and becoming head girl after being voted for by the other students. This popularity was largely due to her warm and welcoming nature and her personality.
Okay, so you're going to have to explain to all of us North Americans and North American listeners, what exactly is sixth form college?
I didn't even think about this, to be honest, when I was looking, but it's basically, in the UK, we have high school from ages 11 to 16, and then we have college between 16 and 18, and then it's on to university or whatever it is that you want to do. But a sixth form college is usually attached to a high school. So it's kind of like the 6th year of being at high school. It's called the sixth form. Other colleges are just called colleges because they're not actually connected to a high school.
Okay, that makes sense. One other question about, British education. What are A-levels? This is totally unrelated, but I want to know what this means.
So at college, you would study A-levels. You can study also, you can study vocational things or, things like that. But most people predominantly go to study A-levels. So that's what you get at the age of 18 when you've finished college, those 2 years. And that's what they use to decide whether you can get into university or not, your A-level results.
Okay, that makes sense. I always wondered because the education system is just the structure is so different than it is in North America.
Yeah, like I said, I hadn't even thought about the fact that a sixth form college would be just unknown to a lot of people.
And what's head girl? Is head girl just like your class president, or what does that mean?
I don't know if it's the same, but it's basically somebody who's voted for by the other students to take on like extra responsibilities. So you might plan events or be like a spokesperson for the school. If you had open days or people coming in to have a look around the school, you'd be the person to take them around and talk about the school, basically. Just a good representative of the school.
That makes sense.
After college, her father cultivated her brother Nigel's interest in journalism by recommending him for a job at the Western Mercury where he worked. And Nigel followed this up by studying journalism and eventually going to work for radio. This interest in journalism was clearly a trait that was shared by the Dando family, as Jill would also go on to a journalistic career. After considering a few other jobs and careers, Jill eventually settled on a job in media. After applying for a number of jobs unsuccessfully, her father helped her to get a job at the Western Mercury, where her brother had previously worked.
I love how they have this legacy of journalism. Like, can you imagine what conversations were like at the Dando dinner table?
I know. I imagine it was quite serious at times, but I imagine it was interesting as well.
Absolutely. Like, it's really cool that Jill decided to follow this career path of both her brother and her father, and that they kind of hooked her up with this job, and she's just starting out. And we know later that she goes on to be an absolute star.
Yeah. Her career at that time was just beginning, and she was really determined to be as successful as she possibly could. Beginning at the bottom with the newspaper, she worked her way up to a reporter and covered local stories to Weston-super-Mare, but it was known to many that Jill had big ambitions and would go further than just her local area. She gained a good reputation for her professionalism and her respect for the story that she was covering.
I think the fact that her dad, on some level, whether unconsciously or consciously, was probably grooming these kids to be, a reporter or to be in media and to be in journalism, because that's what he'd been doing. So he'd been teaching them these lessons all along the way, grooming them to have these jobs. So Jill finishes school and she's like, this is the right career path for me. I'm really not surprised at this point that she's excelling.
No, and I think, he'd obviously passed on quite a lot of good experience that she could then use, in her later career. In 1985, at the age of 23, Jill got given an opportunity to further her career, and she took it with both hands. The job that she went on to take was a presenter on BBC Radio Devon. She'd made the decision to get out of Weston-super-Mare and was set on furthering her career. This was a big step, going from a local newspaper to the famous BBC. She began her career as a programme assistant, but quickly rose through the ranks to become the co-host of their breakfast programme.
Okay, so to compare to what it's like in the US, is this sort of like getting hired on CNN or something like that?
Yeah, I imagine so. Obviously, BBC Devon is like an offshoot of the main BBC, but it's a step up from your kind of local radio station or local newspaper. You are working for the BBC and you kind of on your way, if you wanted then to move on, I guess, to, the main kind of London BBC, that would be where you'd be really, developed your career, the most you probably could.
And it's literally like a big broadcasting company that includes, especially at the time, like radio and television, right? So you've got all these BBC channels as well as radio. So there's so much opportunity for upward mobility for somebody like Jill, who kind of comes in there and is going to knock the socks off of them.
And I think she'd gone from being, reporting on paper to then reporting on the radio. And I think it was just a natural kind of step to move on to TV and that kind of thing, because she was a natural at presenting and knew how to deliver a story. She was being noticed by people in the industry and her hard work was beginning to pay off. Jill's mother, Jean, died in 1986 from leukemia, and she was devastated, having been extremely close to her mother. This affected her, and it was noted that Jill did not enjoy returning to Weston-super-Mare after this point. Despite the tragedy of her mother's passing, Jill felt compelled to continue on in her career, and it went from strength to strength.
This really breaks my heart. Like, I think everybody listening probably can relate to some degree, in the sense that pretty much everybody knows somebody who's died of cancer. I have one of my grandparents who died of cancer, who died before I was born when my dad was 10, so he dealt with the loss of a parent. And it's one of those things that is so sad. You hear that this town, Weston-super-Mare, where she grew up, this beautiful, quaint seaside place, and Jill just can't go back. She can't go there because obviously all of these memories of her mother are just there, and she's probably hit with them like a wave. So the fact that she then threw herself into her work and became even more dedicated and focused isn't surprising to me from what we know of Jill so far.
No, I think it spurred her on. She didn't want to return back to Weston-super-Mare, and in a way, it kind of probably made her think closely about what she did want to do. And she quickly went from presenting on the radio to presenting for TV with BBC Plymouth. She was praised for her natural ability on screen, and she came across as approachable and relatable to the audience. Her determination to succeed gave her an advantage with her work. Jill was being discussed by people within the BBC, and her successes were not going unnoticed. It's unsure how Jill came to be approached by the BBC about a job on their national breakfast show, whether they approached her or she applied for the role, but after some deliberation, she decided to take the plunge and move to London for the job in 1988.
Well, Jill's such a go-getter. I wouldn't be surprised if she heard that there was a job available, or somebody on the inside said, hey, Jill, like, you're exactly what they're looking for. You should apply. But on the other hand, I also wouldn't be surprised if somebody just spotted her and were like, she is exactly what we need.
I'm guessing that she was headhunted in some way. I'm guessing that, she'd been being watched and they thought, oh, that's the exact person we want. Because obviously the National Breakfast Show is a huge show and it's something most people will wake up to and, put on in the morning when they're going about getting ready and things like that. So it was a huge step, I think, from what she'd been doing before. So she moved to London and she moved in with her cousin Judith. Judith had been living in London for a while before deciding it'd make sense for them to move in together. So the pair bought a house and so started Jill's new life in London. Her work on The Breakfast Show made her much more recognisable and put her in the public eye. She was the co-host on the show with Nicholas Witchell, who was already a seasoned presenter on the 6 o'clock news. He'd been asked to move to breakfast after 5 years on the 6 o'clock programme.
So here's a question. How are Brits with regards to famous people? Because you get into different countries and people will often treat those who are like, quote unquote, famous or known, recognizable, very differently. Like I know the British press can be a lot. So at this point in her career, where now Jill is known, would she be basically followed around by the press? Would her dating life be of interest to people? That sort of thing?
I think when she'd first started, possibly not. But I think within a few months of being on The Breakfast Show, yeah, definitely. She was young, she was attractive, she was a beautiful woman. So they would have wanted to know what she was doing, definitely.
I like that she had kind of that sense of comfort or sense of home and that she bought a house with her cousin Judy. I think having that level of familiarity, especially while Jill is clearly grappling with the death of her mother, it's nice to have family close by.
Yeah, I think it does show what kind of person Jill was. Definitely that she had people close to her. I think she obviously felt like that was a good thing to do when she moved to London. The BBC wanted to promote The Breakfast Show to make it just as successful as their 6 o'clock slot. So she had made it to a position of respect on the BBC and she was clearly proud of her achievements. For Jill, however, it was an unsociable job. And it was noted that she often didn't have time for a private life outside of her work. She did have some relationships during this time, but none that particularly flourished into love. She remained friends with a lot of her previous relationships, and they had lots of positive words to say about her and her personality. Her career was progressing quickly, and she was soon thrust into the public eye and began to attend many high-profile events.
Well, at this point in her career, Jill's got a level of fame and notoriety, and so I can imagine that it would be difficult to kind of suss out those potential suitors that would have been there for the right reasons, right? I'm sure there would be plenty that would be courting her because she's famous, because she's known, because to have Jill Dando on your arm would be a great achievement. It would be aspirational for those types of individuals who would date her for those reasons. So finding somebody who's genuine with integrity may be difficult given the lack of free time. Like this, we have to remember, this was like in the 90s. This wasn't now. So dating apps weren't what they are today.
Yeah. And, she was becoming acquainted with lots of other like BBC presenters and even royalty, going to events and dinner parties. And she was really well liked by her colleagues, always polite and on time. And it was an advantage for her. So she was meeting lots and lots of different kinds of people. Her noticeable effect on The Breakfast Show drew the attention of Bob Wheaton, who was the producer on the programme. Their relationship blossomed and the pair grew very close. He pushed Jill to grow her confidence and advised her on the best things to do for her career.
I think it's so cool. You've got this girl from this little seaside town, Western Supermare kind of thing, and she's just bursting onto the scene and she's now meeting royalty. And it's just so sad that her mother never lived to see her attain this level of success. But with regards to her relationship, I think relationships in the workplace, when you're working a crazy amount of hours like Jill was, I think it's only natural that could potentially blossom.
Yeah, definitely. The pair, they were happy. And when their relationship was discovered by the press, there was a lot of interest in how it had developed. The fact that the press were interested in Jill's private life showed that her star was rising in the media world, and she wanted to go on to do other serious shows and topics that would show off her presenting skills. In 1991, she got her break with a presenting role on a TV series. The series was called Safari, and it landed her on the front of the magazine The Radio Times, a weekly TV and radio listings magazine. It led her into a role as the main presenter on the TV programme Holiday in 1992. The programme showed the viewers different places that they could go on holiday, and Jill travelled around the world for the show, experiencing different countries and luxuries.
Well, literally everybody listening is jealous of this. Like,
Yeah.
That's the best job ever.
It does. It definitely sounds like a really good job.
Yeah, it sounds like, literally, like you said, she's just going from strength to strength. Like, being on the cover of the magazine is only going to give her more visibility when she's already out there with the breakfast show. And she's not only charismatic, but Jill's also incredibly attractive. So I can see why the press were kind of very interested in her every move with regards to who she chose to date, why, how the relationship developed, just wanting to know all of these personal details about Jill.
Yeah, and I know that Holiday was, from what I've read, it was a show that Jill was really excited to be on. It was something that she really enjoyed doing, but she was now extremely busy due to her commitment on both the breakfast show and on Holiday. She was featured again on the Radio Times, and she was quickly becoming a household name. Jill's relationship with Bob didn't last during this time on the programme, and the pair split up due to her filming commitments. Jill's career continued well, and her personal life was also going well. In 1994, Jill and Judith sold their flat, and in early 1995, she moved into her own house in Gowan Avenue in Fulham. At the time, Fulham was an up-and-coming place to live, and there were a variety of people living at Gowan Avenue, from families to famous faces and those that wanted to be.
I would love to say the world's just opening up for Jill at this point, but she's so busy with work. You got to wonder, like, how much time does she have to cultivate friendships and relationships outside of her workplace?
I think that was a difficult thing for her. And, I can imagine having to fly all around the world, then come back and do an early breakfast show that often starts at like 6 a.m. It can't have been easy to meet people.
It sounds luxurious, but I think it would be really, really lonely.
Yeah. I mean, she was happy to be living on her own and having her own home, but I can imagine that having to go home, and have only a couple of hours to yourself before you had something else to do, it can't have been easy. And in that same year, she finally got the job that she'd been hoping to get for a long time, the presenter on the TV show Crime Watch. Crime Watch is a BBC programme that documents unsolved crimes and reconstructs them in the hope of getting more information coming in. Jill had moved into the world of serious presenting, and she approached the show with humility and warmth that endeared her to the viewers. She showed empathy to the guests on the show, such as the police officers and the victims, and she was genuinely moved by the stories that were featured on there.
I've seen videos of Jill that are old videos on the show Crime Watch, and she is an absolute natural. She comes off with so much magnetism, and she also has so much empathy. Who she truly is as a person really shines through on screen.
And I think it was, a job that she did really want. She really cared about the kind of objective of Crime Watch and what it was doing. And I think that really helped.
Yeah, and I think that's another element that makes this case so fascinating is Jill was literally in the realm of true crime. That was her job, was reporting on these unsolved crimes. And that element is also really, really compelling.
No, it's got a bit of a sad irony, really, hasn't it? That was her job. And obviously she became a victim. From 1995 to 1999, she was the presenter on the show with Nick Ross. In the years that followed, Jill continued with her career, and she found love when her friend Jenny set her up with a colleague of hers, a gynecologist called Alan Farthing. Jenny had decided they'd be a good match after Alan returned from a job in Australia and split with his wife of 7 years. She was right, and the pair hit it off straight away.
Well, like I said before, there wasn't dating apps like there are today. So meeting people, I think your best course of action is meeting a friend of a friend or meeting somebody, through somebody that that, this friend or family member or colleague can kind of vouch for. And that seems like it was the case with Alan Farthing. Jenny's kind of like, this is a good guy. He split from his wife and Jill meets him and sparks fly.
Yeah, and I think obviously that shows that Jenny knew Jill quite well and knew that they would hit it off. Because their relationship, it became quite serious, and the pair were pictured on holiday together, which made front page news. They appeared happy to be seen together and to share their relationship. Alan and Jill got engaged in February 1999 and were due to get married on the 25th of September that year. They were excited about the engagement and were discussing being featured in OK or Hello magazines. Jill's life was going well and she was happy about the future. It was only 2 months later that tragedy would strike for Jill and her family and friends.
This is so sad. Like, everything is looking up for Jill. She's got this incredible job at Crime Watch, which I'm sure everybody who worked in media or who worked in television was so envious of. She meets this great guy, a doctor, Alan Farthing, and the two of them, obviously, like you said, they get serious really quickly. They're engaged and they're basically planning their wedding spread. And it's like those spreads in OK or Hello, where it's like, look at my engagement ring. We're so happy. Like those, right?
Yeah. And it's, she's finally got to a place, I think, in her life where she's happy with everything. Everything's going exactly how she wants it. And it's really sad.
I know. And like, you can't help but root for Jill. Like, she's faced so much hardship in just losing her mother. And she's clawed her way up from humble beginnings to achieve this amazing star power. So we're all rooting for her. And to know that this, tragedy will strike, it's just heartbreaking.
So on the 26th of April, 1999, the day started like any other Monday morning. Jill had a rare day off from filming and had been staying at Alan's house in Chiswick that weekend. Alan had gone to work early that morning, about 7:30, as he had a meeting. Jill had plans to meet with a friend and attend a charity fashion show at 12:30 that day at the Lanesborough Hotel. But until then, she had the morning free to do some errands. Jill's day is well documented through the CCTV and phone records that would later be analysed by police. It was later established that she'd spoken to a number of people that morning in the process of running her errands. Jill spoke to her friend Jenny at around 9:50 a.m. that morning, and Jill also made some calls to the Prince Edward Theatre to try and get some show tickets. She didn't get through either of the first times that she tried to ring that morning. She's then picked up on CCTV at a garage service till at around 10:22 a.m, paying for petrol and some other things.
So we basically have this day that seems to be both spontaneous but well documented, given the CCTV footage and the testimony of others. So it seems like what it's leading up to, like, perfect. We've got all of these elements lined up. It should serve as clues, but unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated than that.
We do have all this CCTV and the phone calls and everything, and it shows that it was a normal Monday morning. Like you say, it was spontaneous. She was kind of deciding to do things kind of off the hop, but also that she had plans for that day. She had different things to attend to that morning and didn't stay in one place for a while. She next travelled to the King's Mall in Hammersmith, which was less than 2 miles from her house in Gowan Avenue in Fulham. She went to a number of shops in the mall, including Ryman's stationery shop, where she bought a ream of paper. She then went looking in a few more shops, and it was assumed she'd been looking for a fax machine ink cartridge, as she'd mentioned that it was broken. She was seen clearly on CCTV after going into several other shops and then exiting the mall and crossing the road in the direction of her car, which was parked nearby. At 11:04 a.m, she's seen driving away from the mall and driving towards Fulham. She made a shortcut to avoid traffic at 11:20, and Jill is seen parking her car on Munster Road, just around the corner from her home. She went into Cope's Fishmongers and bought some fish for dinner that evening. At about 11:30 a.m, Jill was seen leaving the Fishmongers, getting into her car and travelling back to her home. A call to Jill's phone at 11:31, however, was unanswered.
So do we know that the last call that she has is with her friend Jenny? Or is there another call that is after that?
I think it's the phone call with Jenny. I don't think any other phone call after that is mentioned. Whether there were phone calls in between, it might not have been published, but I think the fact that a call at 11:31 was unanswered kind of proves that maybe there wasn't.
She wasn't maybe talking on the phone after that. Because, I mean, it's not a huge amount of time, right? We're looking at an hour and 41 minutes since she spoke to Jenny. But I think the fact that her and Jenny are so close, like, not only did she introduce her and Alan, but this is somebody who clearly Jill speaks to on a regular basis. So even though her job is so demanding, it's really nice to hear that she has had time to cultivate not only this relationship that is supposed to turn into marriage because they're engaged, but also friendships with people like Jenny, who she goes out of her way to make sure that she speaks to on what seems like a very regular basis.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't know who called her at 11:31, I don't think. I don't think it's actually been said. It may have been Jenny, it may have been somebody else, but it proves that obviously at that point something had happened to Jill, that she wasn't answering the phone, because previously to that, she was answering and she was travelling around. But at 11:45 a.m., one of Jill's neighbours, Helen Doble, was walking down the street, heading in the direction of Jill's house. Helen knew Jill to speak to and noticed that her car was parked outside the house in its space. She'd thought she might catch her for a chat, so she looked into the path towards her door. She saw something that would stick in her mind forever. In the doorway, there was a woman crumpled in a heap in a large pool of blood. Helen was shocked to see that the woman was Jill, her keys still in her hand.
Poor Helen. Can you imagine that you have this lovely neighbor, and I'm sure Jill, by all accounts, is just this wonderfully friendly, warm, compassionate human being who everybody kind of gravitated towards. So her neighbor Helen's like, perfect. Jill's home. Like, let us grab a quick chat. And then she goes up and she sees this amazing woman who, or what appears to be her because it's her home. And this isn't a neighborhood where it's high crime. Like, let's just say that now. This is an affluent neighborhood in the middle of the day. Helen must have been shocked and so traumatized by this. Like, my heart goes out to her.
And I can imagine it was surprising because she'd just been walking up the street. And obviously, I imagine in her head, she was thinking, when did this happen? And she could see that clearly something awful had happened to her. She noticed that the gate was closed, and before going into the path, she decided she needed to preserve as much evidence as she could because obviously this looked like a murder to her immediately. She rang 999 emergency services and described that due to the amount of blood, she assumed that she'd been stabbed and she looked like she might already be dead. She also told them that confidentially, the victim was Jill Dando. She quickly went and got a neighbour so that she wasn't alone at the scene. The neighbour came and exclaimed that she also thought that she looked dead, but ran to a doctor's office at the end of the road to get help.
Well, thank God for Helen and the fact that she was quick to act. We know that there's no intervention that Helen could have done, but the more time that passed that Jill was there, the more likely people are to forget. You may not get to question witnesses, but it's also just one thing that's worth adding is for all of you listening in North America, in the UK, they've got a huge amount of knife crime. And that's due to the fact that guns are very difficult to obtain. So if you think that it's weird that she assumed, because if you're in the US, you might assume that she was shot, but it's different in England. You're more likely to assume somebody was stabbed if you see a large amount of blood, correct?
Yeah, I wouldn't immediately jump to somebody had been shot. Definitely you would assume there'd been some sort of assault or, she'd been stabbed. But I think Helen had a lot of presence of mind to say, I'm not going to touch the gate, I'm not going to get involved with the evidence. And I think because it was Jill, she knew this was going to be a big investigation and a big story.
Great that Helen had the presence of mind and was intelligent enough not to go and touch too many things, to know to speak to emergency services, to know to contact the clinic, just in case there was some kind of possible intervention that could have been done. Helen covered all of her bases and she acted exactly how somebody should behave in that situation.
Yeah. The emergency services were quick to arrive at the scene and tried everything they could to try and revive Jill, while onlookers on the street tried to come to terms with what had happened. What could possibly have happened to her in broad daylight on her own doorstep? The crime was brazen and unheard of for many of the families that lived at Gowan Avenue. The police, paramedics and air ambulance arrived and Jill was removed from the scene to Charing Cross Hospital. Later that afternoon, she was officially pronounced dead.
I don't know why in my head I have this kind of image of maybe just because of the way Jill looked, the way she's described, that she was just this really amazing person. I have this idea that like the whole country would have been gripped almost the way they were gripped when Princess Diana died. Not to that level, but in the same kind of thing. Am I completely off base here?
No, and there were a lot of comparisons with Jill and Princess Diana because they did have a similar look. They did look a little bit similar and kind of dressed a bit the same. And obviously they'd taken Jill into the hearts as well. She was really well loved in the way that Diana was. So no, I agree. It was obviously now a murder and the whole scene was confusing. There was lots of different information coming in due to the nature of the crime, but also the profile of the victim. The police were on the case immediately after the discovery of Jill's body, and there was a lot of media coverage and scrutiny due to the fame that she had nationally. The first thing that was established was that Jill had not been stabbed, as was the original observation. Jill had been shot in the temple with a single bullet at close range.
Well, this had to be really shocking for not only the public, but also for investigators, because this was a crime that happened in the middle of the day. And you've got to wonder, is this person using a silencer? Because you've got all these people around and we know she's not answering her phone at 11:31. And it's like 15 minutes later that she's discovered by Helen. So there's a window of time here that Jill may have been laying kind of unresponsive in a pool of her own blood. So you've got to wonder, like, it must have really shocked investigators. They probably did kind of assume that what Helen assumed, that she was likely stabbed due to the degree of difficulty it takes for one to obtain a firearm in the UK.
Yeah, it was even more shocking, as you say, particularly in the UK, because guns are usually not used in crimes unless connected to gangs or underworld figures. The police were faced with the horrific crime perpetrated by a person who didn't think twice about shooting someone in the daytime in a populated street. Who would do such a thing? The nation was rocked by the crime and couldn't believe that someone who had been a part of their lives due to her television roles had been killed so brutally. Many couldn't believe that anyone would want to do such a thing to Jill Dando.
Oh, this must have been so difficult for the public to grasp, right? Who would want to murder Jill? And I think you could have, very early on, people are going to be thinking, well, it's either somebody with mental health issues or maybe is potentially stalking her, which I think would be a logical thing given that Jill's famous.
Yeah.
And then the brazen nature of the crime, the fact that it was like one shot and it was a gun used and it was during the day speaks to, could this have been a hit? But then we come back to, if so, put on Jill by whom?
Well, it seems like someone who was confident carrying out a crime like this, because if you weren't criminally sophisticated, you wouldn't have even attempted to murder someone like that in the street, in daylight, and just walk away casually and manage to get away before anybody sees you. I think the police were definitely confused from the outset, and it was trying to figure out which theory fits, I think. They started immediately on the case and launched Operation Oxborough, which was the largest police investigation since the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. They were quickly under pressure to find some evidence that could help. They initially looked for any forensic evidence that had been left at the scene, but due to the fact that Jill had been moved by paramedics, it was difficult to establish what the scene had originally looked like and what her original position was.
I think that's always the difficult thing, right? When they're trying to basically administer these life-saving kind of interventions and measures, you're oftentimes going to disturb the scene. And at this point in time, Jill probably hadn't been dead for that long. She probably wasn't cold. Her body was probably still the same temperature. And there may have been some hope that we can revive her. So that takes precedence over the preservation of the scene if they thought there was a possibility that they may have been able to revive her. So that's difficult for investigators. It's been compromised to a degree at that point. You're never going to get the scene back to what it originally once was.
No, and there was a lack of forensic evidence anyway at the scene, even though they had all the different parts of the bullet that had killed Jill. They had the full cartridge that had been expelled from the gun, the shell and the bullet. They were lying on different parts of the front porch. The postmortem showed that the bullet had entered above Jill's left ear and had exited above her right ear. Her head had an imprint of the muzzle of the gun where it had been pressed against it.
And that might answer the question. If it had been pressed right against her head, it may almost serve as a silencer and that it would muffle the loud gunshot sound, don't you think?
Yeah, that's what the police said. It had created the effect of a silencer.
I think it speaks to the fact that, like what you said, that there is a level of confidence here. It's so brazen. It's done in the middle of the day. This person is confident in their ability to not only handle a gun, but to understand human anatomy enough to know one shot was enough and doing it in the middle of the day. Like that is crazy confidence. And it speaks to somebody who's done this before.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. The cartridge of the gun itself was interesting as it had marks along the sides which were called crimping. This crimping had been done by hand for a specific purpose, but what the purpose was unknown to the police. It was described as possibly coming from a deactivated and then reactivated gun. A deactivated gun is modified so it's unable to be fired. but deactivated guns can be reactivated so they're able to be used again. According to an article in The Telegraph in 2006, deactivated guns had been available to buy legally in the UK, and it was possible to reactivate them quite easily by those in the know. Deactivated guns are allowed in the UK, but they have to be deactivated properly and officially, and it's illegal to reactivate them for any purpose.
Well, this sounds like an easy way to circumvent it's difficult to find a gun in the UK. If you can get your hands on a deactivated gun and you're familiar with the mechanics and you understand how to then reactivate the gun, well, what a great way to commit a crime, right? Because you aren't going to have to fill out the same kind of paperwork. You may be able to get it through underworld connections, but you may be able to get it through a more benign source because people aren't going to assume that you're going to use this for sinister purposes.
No, and when I read about this, I had no idea that this was a thing. I didn't know anything about deactivated guns. I didn't know that you were able to buy them. And I think, if it isn't something that's known to the public, so it obviously is somebody that has done their research.
I've never even heard of deactivated guns. It's like literally this case is the first time I've ever even heard of it. No,
neither had I. And I didn't know you could reactivate them. And I think you're right. It shows that it's somebody who has really, really thought this through. They might not be, an underworld figure, they may be, but also, like you said, they could just be somebody who's done a lot of research into how they were going to carry this out. The police believe that the gun may have been a reactivated gun. However, without the gun itself, it was proving very difficult to establish. The forensic team scoured the area around the crime scene, mostly on their hands and knees, searching the path and the street for any clues that could help them, and in the hope the perpetrator may have got rid of the gun on the way from the scene. It didn't turn up anything that was useful, and the police were only able to find objects that could not be connected directly to the case. According to David Smith's book, All About Jill, The Life and Death of Jill Dando, quote, the gun that had been used to shoot Jill was a 9mm shot, which was uncommon in criminal usage.
That's interesting. But the thing is, if it's uncommon in criminal usage, but it's available as a deactivated gun, it may be something that wouldn't be tied back to a criminal network or to a criminal syndicate if one was trying to do forensic countermeasures or a level of misdirection.
Yeah. The gun, it was unusual and it looked to have been adapted in some way, either cut down or reactivated. All of this information wasn't disclosed at the time and was held back from the public. But the police were confused by who the perpetrator might have been and what their motive was. Was it a skilled hitman, or was it someone who just happened to be in the right place when Jill came home? It was a confusing and very highly publicised crime, but it wasn't the only manhunt that was going on in London at the time, which added extra pressure for the police.
So what was the other manhunt that was going on?
Well, during the time that Jill was killed, the police were in search of the infamous nail bomber. The so-called nail bomber had first planted one of his bombs at Brixton Market in South London on the 17th of April 1999, just 9 days before Jill's murder. He'd put it in a sports bag and left it at the market. Brixton Market traders noticed the bag and were suspicious of why it had been left there. Several people moved the bag away from the crowded areas of the market. The bag ended up being put outside an Iceland supermarket, and just before the police arrived at the scene, the bag exploded, injuring 48 people. Lots of the people had been severely injured due to the fact that 4-inch nails had been placed around the bomb.
This is literally devastating. Can you imagine being kind of in the blast radius of this bomb and being impaled by a 4-inch nail? Mm-hmm. It's horrifying.
And I think, it's crazy because if you watch there's videos and there's, reconstructions and things of what happened, and people were suspicious of the bag, but they didn't know what to do with it. So instead, they just moved it around the market away from people, so they did know it was suspicious, but knowing what to do in that situation. I mean, it's just a bag. No one was expecting it to be a bomb with 4-inch nails in it.
No, I mean, ideally, if somebody had like a truck bed to put it in the back that was closed off, or a freezer, put a rock on top of it, but people aren't going to investigate any further. They just want to be as far away from this kind of suspicious bag or package as possible. These people aren't experts. They're just everyday people who are doing their best not to get injured and not knowing, as you said, how to respond in a situation such as this.
But obviously the 4-inch nails in the bomb was how he had acquired his name of the nail bomber. But the next bomb was placed on the 24th of April, just 2 days before Jill's murder. This bomb was placed in Brick Lane in East London and was again put inside a sports bag. A man found the bag and took it to Brick Lane police station. He placed it instead inside the boot of his car, and unfortunately it exploded. 13 people were injured in this attack, but there were amazingly no fatalities.
This must have been a pretty powerful bomb if it exploded in the trunk and it still managed to injure 13 people. Like, it's amazing that there were no fatalities.
I can imagine at this point the police are just wondering why, is there any specific reason? Are they targeting anything specific? But by the, at that time, it was obviously very difficult to establish that. And at the time of Jill's murder, the police were undertaking a huge investigation to try and find the nail bomber, and everyone in London was worried about where there could be the next attack. It put fear into many people about where they could hit next, and the resources were heavily put into looking for the bomber. The last attack of the nail bomber hit the Admiral Duncan pub in the centre of Soho. On Friday the 30th of April, which was the start of the bank holiday weekend, and just 4 days after Jill's murder. The pub was packed and everyone was having a good time, ready for a long weekend. The bomber had left the sports bag near the bar, and the bomb exploded and caused catastrophic injuries to many of the people in the pub. Over 100 people were severely injured and 3 people died in the explosion.
This is so sad. And I just imagine this neighborhood pub where everybody's really close and a lot of these people are friends. Like, something like this to happen at a pub like that, where not only 100 people are severely injured, you've got 3 fatalities. That must have been such a hard hit for all the people in this neighborhood.
It was a local pub, so a lot of the people lived around there. A lot of the people knew each other, and it was busy. It was a holiday weekend, and obviously that was one of the reasons why the nail bomber must have chosen that kind of place. But the attack was so horrific, and it shocked the world with its severity. The perpetrator was quickly tracked down after this bombing, as he'd been identified on CCTV from Brixton Market and his picture had been circulated. People came forward to explain who he was and that they knew him. He was identified as 23-year-old David Copeland. He was happy to explain that he'd committed the crimes himself and that no one had helped him, and his room was littered with information about bombs and contained Nazi flags.
So his objective, was it racially motivated, or is this guy just spewing hate? Because it seems almost indiscriminate. Or was the neighborhood that he chose to place the bomb in that pub where he had those 3 fatalities, was it like a predominantly, say Jewish neighborhood or something?
Well, his motivation was prescribed to far-right ideals, and he believed that the attacks would be triggering a war between communities. He'd intentionally placed the bombs in places with communities that he didn't agree with, such as minority communities like the Afro-Caribbean community in Brixton, the Bangladeshi community in Brick Lane, and the LGBTQ community in Soho. So, yeah, he obviously that was what his motivation was, and he was happy. The thing is, he was happy to tell police that was what it was, which is awful. He was convicted in 2000 and was sentenced to 6 concurrent life sentences. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but this didn't affect his sentence as they believed he still held responsibility due to the severity of his actions. In 2007, it was ruled that he would remain in prison until at least 2049, and in 2011, he lost his appeal to this ruling.
This is really sad, right? You've got somebody who's obviously dealing with a mental illness, but I think schizophrenia, there's typically a level of disorganization. And here we're seeing a very organized perpetrator. So it seems to be kind of counterintuitive to how one would typically describe, the crimes of somebody who's a paranoid schizophrenic, right? One I think of is the Vampire of Sacramento. Like, this was somebody who should have been caught earlier, but his actions were very clear. They were disorganized and he just got by on luck. But in this case, it seems like he went to very great lengths with a very clear objective. And he did so in almost either a very organized capacity, or police were just disorganized in hunting him down. Like, they did do so eventually. But the fact that he evaded capture for his first 2 initial bombings is almost shocking. That I do believe that, they're correct in their diagnosis, but I understand the severity of the sentence.
Yeah. And, I think police were obviously convinced that there must have been evidence to suggest that he had been planning this and he knew exactly the communities he was going to target and for what reasons. And I think obviously the fact when he was caught, he just said, yeah, that was me. I did it and I did it for these reasons. I think that was what convinced them. But this was the backdrop for the police as they attempted to find out what had happened to Jill in the first few days of the investigation. Obviously, they had a lot of resources going into the nail bomber investigation, and now this had happened. As the forensic search had not thrown up anything that could possibly help them, they had to turn to witnesses that may have seen something that day. It was thought as the crime had happened during the day and on her doorstep, someone must have seen something of interest.
Yeah, you've literally got to believe, given that we went through Jill's day, we rehashed all the people she spoke to, where she was seen on CCTV, who she spoke to on the phone, the errands that she ran, when she got home. Like, we know crazy amount of details here, like an inordinate amount of details about Jill's day based on CCTV, witnesses, and people she spoke to. So it's pretty reasonable to assume that somebody would have seen or heard something.
Well, everyone in Jill's life was spoken to about what they knew, and many of her family and friends were ruled out as being anyone of interest, including her fiancé, Alan Farthing, who'd been at the hospital that morning and had only been told about her death at around midday. The first person who emerged with any important information was her next-door neighbour, as documented in detail in David James Smith's book. Her neighbour had reported that morning he'd been working from home when sometime after 11:30 he heard the sound of Jill's car alarm as she parked up. He didn't think anything of hearing this, as he'd often heard her coming home. He heard Jill coming up the footpath to her house, and then about 20 to 30 seconds later, he heard a scream. This scream didn't sound like one of fear to the neighbour, but as though she'd been surprised by someone playing a joke. It sounded like someone that she knew.
It's so funny that witnesses in these situations, not funny, haha, but almost ironic that people will think sometimes that it's a joke or somebody that they know or a prank, because you're never going to assume that somebody is hunting your neighbor, who is this famous TV presenter, down to do them harm in the middle of the day. Like, it's too shocking that I think you'll make excuses and justifications in your head and go, oh, it's nothing. It's probably just a prank, even if it does kind of raise concern, because we will kind of explain those things away that are deeply unsettling at times.
Yeah, and I think he obviously also means that it wasn't like an ear-splitting scream. It wasn't something disturbing sounding. It was obviously just something that sounded normal to him at the time. He next heard the sound of Jill's gate being closed, which was also noted by Helen Doble when she arrived at the scene. The neighbour decided to have a look out of the window and saw a man walking away from Jill's path. The man was described as looking decent and respectable and someone that Jill may have known, someone that Jill may have been friends with. He looked back to the house for a second and then walked off down the street. The neighbour got a relatively good look at the man, who's described as having a heavy build, thick black hair, taller than 5'7", with a Barber-style wax jacket, which was brown, and what looked like a mobile phone in his hand.
So what you've got is a guy who's heavy set, so he may be a few pounds overweight, and he's a couple inches shorter than average. So we're looking at a pretty average individual here, and based on this description, it's not like this guy has something that's majorly an identifying feature, like he's got a mole under his right eye, or he's got spiky purple hair, something that could be used to identify him. This guy is just, he's got black hair and a brown jacket. I mean,
it shows that he may have just blended in the street. I mean, no one would have looked twice at somebody who just looks like they're walking down the street or, live in the street or something like that.
So we have to question, did this person in dressing for the day, if their objective was to kill Jill Dando, which it looks like that it was, did they dress accordingly? Is this the way that they dressed all the time? Would they always fit in? Or did they pick this outfit with the express purpose of being to blend in this neighborhood?
Yeah, well, nothing apparently seemed odd to the neighbour at that stage, as he believed this person could easily have been friends with Jill. Nothing on the street seemed disturbed, and he noticed that his other neighbours seemed to be going about their usual business. It was only when he learnt about Jill's murder that what he'd seen that day took on a new importance.
This is like spine chilling, just to think that this brazen individual walks up to Jill in the middle of the day and it's not even noon yet. He walks up to Jill in the middle of the day. He pulls out a gun, fires one shot, kills her. And the thing is, she doesn't make an alarming enough scream for her neighbor to believe that something terrible's happening to Jill. And there's all of these other neighbors around. And probably due to the fact that he had the gun muzzle pressed up against her temple, that a gunshot wasn't heard loudly. So everybody's just literally going around their business as Jill lay dying on the street. And this is so sad.
Clearly the street didn't look any different to usual. And if that had been me and I looked out, you just wouldn't think anything of it, would you? Because you would think if something awful had happened that you would be able to tell. And I think it is scary that he couldn't. The description of the man was an important lead for police who had a description now of a possible suspect. In the first few hours into the investigation, the police tried to get as many statements from witnesses as possible, but it quickly transpired that despite the fact the crime had happened on the doorstep, nobody had actually witnessed the murder. There wasn't enough detail about the man that was seen leaving the scene to create an e-fit. There were some e-fits eventually released of a man and of a Range Rover car that they believe was involved, but in hindsight it was unsure if these were any help at all.
I mean, in this neighborhood, I'm sure that there's plenty of Range Rovers. And so the fact that we don't have any of these major witnesses who are the ones who, are right there, as far as we know, saying they saw this Range Rover parked nearby, it may be connected, it may not be, may be helpful, might not. Same with the e-fits. For the person who, really saw what this individual looked like, it didn't seem that they had a crazy detailed kind of memory. And it goes to what you said. This person blended in. You didn't think twice about them. And so I've got a very difficult time taking eyewitness accounts as being extremely credible unless we have a ton of eyewitnesses and you're kind of combining all of the things that they're saying and then forming a picture. But it seems like the information we have here is spotty at best. So I would have a hard time believing that this e-fit is indeed accurate.
Yeah, and I think the police did as well. I think that was why they had to reach out and ask the public as a whole. And strangely, they turned to the programme that Jill had worked so hard on in the years prior to her death, Crime Watch, for help. The programme was happy to help in the investigation and they reconstructed the crime for the viewers.
This is just so sad, but it's literally like it's come full circle for Jill. This is a woman who is so dedicated to the families and the victims of crimes. And then, like you said earlier on in the program, she herself then becomes a victim of an unsolved crime. So to have her colleagues covering her unsolved murder, my heart just goes out for her father and her brother at this time, because it must have been so hard just seeing all this press coverage of Jill. Like, on one hand, you're so happy that everybody cares and you're so happy that all of these resources are being put into finding out what happened to her. But on the other hand, it's so difficult because there is no answer and you're constantly reminded with this pain, this open wound, this grief that you're experiencing, and there just is no resolution.
No, and if you watch that Crime Watch program, you can tell that like her co-host and all the people on it are really devastated that they have to be doing this on the show, and you can tell that they're upset, and it is really sad that, I think they were happy, like they say, to be helping, but it's so sad that they had to do it at all. The episode of Crime Watch created a huge number of phone calls and leads that the police have to sift through in the hope of finding something of importance. Some of the leads came in from people in the general area of Gowan Avenue. Many of the tips described seeing a man near and around the street before and after the murder. Some of these tips described a man wearing a similar jacket to that described by the neighbour. Others described seeing a man on the phone at around the time of the murder.
So we got to wonder, is this man who's seen in this brown wax Barber style jacket, or however it was described, which sounds weird to me. Like, what is a wax Barber style jacket? Do you know what that looks like?
Yeah, Barber, that's a brand of jacket. It's
okay.
It's like, I don't know how you describe it. It was kind of made, I imagine, for like outdoor things, like farmers might have them on, or, things like that. And it's kind of got a little like corduroy collar. So it's supposed to be like a kind of waterproof jacket, but then it became popular and it's, to wear out and about. It's quite an expensive jacket.
Okay, so is this like expensive, like a Burberry jacket's expensive?
Maybe not that expensive, but it's a couple of £100. So it's a relatively expensive jacket for the average person.
Okay, because I, in my head, had this picture of like this fake brown leather jacket, but that's not at all what it is. So I'm glad you cleared that up because this may mean something, right? If you're saying that it's something that farmers have and whatever, could this be somebody who's outdoors a lot?
I think it started off as a jacket like that, but it's become more of like an expensive brand that, you know, if you've got some money, you might wear one.
Okay.
So it's hard to tell, really. It would be a jacket that would blend in, but it would also probably make it look like it's somebody that Jill might have known who had some money to spend. It's hard to explain.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. It's like, it's not necessarily that he'd be doing outdoor work, but it's sort of like if you're wearing an expensive track jacket, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to run track.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So some described that this person had a similar jacket, but whether these witnesses just saw someone with a brown jacket and it was somebody completely different, you know, they didn't know. Some people described seeing an unusual car that was not normally parked there. Many of these leads could be checked out and people were ruled out as being involved, such as a utility worker who just happened to be in the area for a job. Other leads simply didn't provide enough information for the police to investigate. They were frankly overwhelmed with information from the public, and the investigators kept going back to the original questions. Who were we looking for? What was the motive? And what kind of person would have committed it?
Well, I would think a utility worker would very quickly be ruled out, given the fact that this person wasn't wearing like what utility workers would typically wear.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think, you know, that person had a reason to be in the area. So it wasn't exactly suspicious. But Jill's victimology was difficult to establish as she was such a public figure. And it was important to try and work out if this crime was committed as a result of her personal or of her public life. The police were starting to realise that they may be dealing with a stranger murder, which was notoriously difficult to pin down.
Yeah, it's so much harder because statistically speaking, for most people, when somebody hurts you, kills you, perpetrates any type of criminal offense against you, specifically violent, offenses such as assault, rape, murder, they're usually somebody within your inner circle, somebody who you know and trust. But we have this other element that adds to the complexity of Jill's victimology, and that's the fact that Jill's essentially famous. So this opens her up to so many other potential perpetrators that may feel as though they know Jill. Even though they don't actually have a literal connection to her, they may feel as though they do. So yeah, of course, there could be somebody stalking her. There could be any multitude of reasons that somebody felt they could have been like, quote unquote, slighted or something like that.
Well, one of the next things that was considered was whether she had been followed to the location of her house. It was a puzzling part of the crime, as how did the perpetrator know what time she would have arrived at her home? The investigators began to look into CCTV cameras in the area that she might have been. It was a tough and long-winded job, as they had to check around 500 hours worth of CCTV footage and around 191 cameras, but in the end they were able to establish a timeline for Jill's day. They followed her as she carried out her errands and arrived home. The result was disappointing, however, as nothing of interest was found on this footage.
Okay, so I've got a question here. Okay, so this individual seems like they're organized. They seem like they're confident, which leads me to believe personally that there's a high probability that they could have been following Jill. And if they are organized and have done this before, they may know to keep a certain distance and be very aware of CCTV. Or who knows, they could have put a GPS locator on Jill's vehicle. Something like that, right? So they're tracking where she is while maintaining a safe distance. But I wonder if that Range Rover was seen while combing through the CCTV, but they were unable to say if there was for sure a connection, which was why they kind of just said, hey, maybe connected, but maybe not.
Yeah, I think the witnesses had noticed a Range Rover and they may possibly have seen it on the CCTV as well. But I guess unless they saw the car following her from one place to another, they couldn't directly say that she was being followed by anybody. I think that was the difficulty. They couldn't say, oh, there's that car again, there's that car in that location, and definitively say that person must have been following her. But it appeared to the police that nobody had been following Jill at all, and nothing and nobody suspicious was noted on the footage. The investigators also looked at phone records in the area of both Fulham and Chiswick, where Alan lived. Some of the witnesses had described seeing the suspicious man using a mobile phone. They hoped by searching phone records they might find something that connected the suspect with Jill or someone in her known circle of family or friends. The police analysed 80,000 phone records in the areas, and again, to their dismay, nothing important or relevant to the investigation came up.
Poor Alan, I really feel for him. He's supposed to be marrying Jill. And luckily for Alan, he was at work while this crime was perpetrated against Jill, because we know if we look at statistics, it's typically somebody close to the victim, which is what we said. So if Alan didn't have a good alibi, he could have very likely been a suspect early on. So thankfully, he's dealing with enough grief. It's very fortunate that they ruled him out early on. But in looking at all these phone records, the fact that they found nothing, it doesn't mean that, somebody wasn't following her, wasn't keeping tabs on her. But there's a very low probability that this person was in contact with Jill on any regular basis, or investigators would have turned this up.
No, and as we've said, if this person was as organised as they appear to be, then they wouldn't have made it easy to make a connection. So, that's what made it difficult for the police. They couldn't find any connection whatsoever. And also the perpetrator hadn't left any evidence behind to say who they might be. So at that point, the investigation slowed down and Jill's family and friends were left to try and put together their lives after her death. Her funeral took place on the 21st of May 1999 in Weston-super-Mare, where she'd been born. The funeral was attended by lots of well-wishers and people who loved Jill, but also by those that didn't even know her.
Sure, it was absolutely packed. And again, we've got Jill coming full circle here. This is where she was born. She lost her mother in Weston-super-Mare and she didn't want to go back. She had a desire to get out, but now she's returning back to her roots, returning back to the soil. There's something poetic about that, even though it's so heartbreaking.
And I think the fact that people turned up that didn't even know her shows that, she was loved by a lot of people. Her warmth and welcoming nature made many people feel like they knew her, and the public mourned as well as her family and friends. So because of the high-profile nature and the fact that people were so devastated, the police were feeling under increased pressure to find someone who had something to do with the murder, as they were struggling to find any evidence that pointed to a suspect. It wasn't that there were no suspects, but there were so many people who could have been a suspect that they were struggling to narrow it down. As they had no information at all, anyone was being treated as a suspect. They checked out Jill's previous relationships and had taken blood tests from these people. They checked out every name in 486 contacts in Jill's Filofax and found nothing that was deemed to be suspicious.
Can you imagine the amount of money and resources, time that all of these investigators and people in the forensics lab, they're running all these DNA profiles, looking into all these phone records. This has got to be priority number one. So much pressure on investigators from the public to get results.
I think that was it. It was a huge amount of pressure. They needed to find somebody. They needed to find something to at least make the public believe that they were doing, a good job. I mean, quite clearly, it was an extensive investigation. They've looked at lots of things, but nothing was coming up. There was no leads coming out. And the theory that the suspect could be someone who had an unhealthy obsession with Jill began to be circulated around that time and looked into. Around the first year anniversary of Jill's death, the police began to look seriously into this theory. It turned out that there were a number of people that the police discovered who had a strange obsession with Jill. This wasn't unusual for celebrities, but of course in this situation, these obsessions could be seen as dangerous.
Well, yeah, she's a public figure. I always think of, did you watch The Crown?
I've not watched all of it. I've watched some of it.
I skipped to the most current season and I didn't watch the earlier ones, but the one with Princess Diana on it, I think it's season 4. Mm-hmm. And there's that scene where the guy basically breaks into the castle to talk to Queen Elizabeth. And it didn't happen at all how I thought that it did. It was a very civil conversation where this guy was just at the end of his rope, right? But you think of these people who are like him. There was no malice towards the queen or anything, but there's probably these people out there who, somebody like Jill or anybody famous, you see these situations where there's stalkers. They believe that there's some connection. They're reading something in due to mental health issues that this person is either talking to them, that they're connected in some way. And so unbeknownst to whatever this famous person, presenter, Jill Dando in this case, she could have had a myriad of individuals who believed that they were connected to her and some of them could have wished her harm. Some of them may have just wanted to get close to her. We can't know the answer to all of this for sure, but it is kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, and I think the police, that was the thing. They didn't know which of these people may have had, an unhealthy obsession, or wanted to harm her. They looked into around 4,000 people in connection with Jill, and they discovered that around 150 of these had unhealthy obsessions with her. It was reported that one man had tried to take over her BT account to gain access to her phone records. Another man had tried to look into her utility account, and another had hundreds of pictures of Jill on his computer. The police also looked into people in the area that had been arrested for other crimes, and either resembled the E-Fits or had a connection to the Range Rover seen in the area. A number of people were interviewed, including one man who was one of the only other people that was arrested for Jill's murder.
Yeah, it feels like they're literally looking into everybody. And I'm sure when you start looking and peeling back this curtain, you're going to see a lot of individuals with kind of questionable conduct. I mean, this guy's got all these photos, and a lot of these people aren't going to be kind of incentivized to act in any way, that they're just going to have this private experience with this obsession within their own home. They're not going to seek out this individual. But the difficult thing for police is to know which ones are going to act, which ones aren't. And, you could have hundreds of individuals who have unhealthy obsessions. And how do you go about eliminating them as suspects?
No, and in David James Smith's book, All About Jill, The Life and Death of Jill Dando, he discusses the man that was arrested for Jill's murder to say that he was an undertaker who had contacted police to say he was the man in the E-Fit. He said he'd been seen driving around the area at the time of the murder. The police searched his home and found, quote, spectacle frames with no lenses in, an MOT certificate for a Range Rover, some BBC correspondence, an estate agent's aerial photograph of Fulham, and a dark 3/4 length coat. It turned out that the man had a history of confessing to crimes and had been convicted for making a false claim for reward money.
So is the coat that is described, like from your description, it sounded more like a short coat, like a sport type coat.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, kind of. It could appear longer depending on how tall the person was, I guess.
Okay.
But just a dark 3/4 length coat isn't really a, accurate description.
What's a certificate for a Range Rover? Is that like he's rented a Range Rover? What does that mean?
An MOT is something in the UK that you've got to get done on your car to make sure it's roadworthy. So you get a certificate back to say you're okay to drive it.
Okay, that makes sense. So we know that this guy has a Range Rover, but I mean, he did come forward saying it was him in the E-Fits, but he didn't come forward saying, I did it, did he?
No, I don't think so, no. He came forward to just say that he was the person in the E-Fit. But then they discovered he had a history of confessing to crimes. The man was taller than the man in the E-Fit, and he had described that he was driving in his hearse, which was not spotted on CCTV at all that day. So his story didn't match with what happened on the day that Jill was murdered.
It should seem easy enough if these investigators have checked this Range Rover. Did potentially somebody get a license plate or some identifier other than the fact it was a Range Rover? Because if this guy was working during the day, that should be easy enough to check. If he is an undertaker, he would likely be driving the hearse and not his personal vehicle.
Yeah, so I think it just proves that there were people coming forward with information, and it was kind of wasting police resources, really, having to look into all of these things because they were proven false, really. They'd investigated a number of other suspicious people in the area and found none that matched what they already knew about the scene.
Like the John Bonet case, right? You've got all of these strange suspects coming out of the woodwork and people even confessing to the crime. But the reality is the police have to just do their due diligence and eliminate these people as suspects because not everyone who confesses to a crime is guilty of the crime.
No, exactly. And I think it proves that people will come forward with information for whatever reason. And you've got to take it seriously because if you don't investigate it, you might miss something. But obviously, at the same time, you've put all those resources in and it turns out it's not the person. The police were clearly looking into the theory of an obsessive stalker, and it would be what would lead them to look back to the original information that they got in the early part of the investigation. They checked back on a tip that came in about a man called Barry Michael George. His name was reported by HAFAD, a disability charity, a number of times in the early days of the investigation, due to the fact that he had come in during the week of Jill's murder and had been very suspicious and been very agitated with the staff.
Well, yes, sure, that could strike them as suspicious, but everything that we've gone through so far is that this person doesn't sound like somebody who would seamlessly blend into an environment like this neighborhood. And it's also sounding like there's some strong emotions that would stand out if you were to walk past this person and they're enraged, they're treating the staff a certain way. Maybe he shoots you a glare, but it seems like this would stand out. And the perpetrator that we've been describing seems like an extremely organized individual who's acting in a very kind of cold, calculated manner, in almost a logical way, not in an emotional way. And this individual sounds like he's very emotionally driven.
Yeah, but the police did look into it as a credible lead. They knew his name as Barry Bulsara, the staff at the charity. But when police cross-referenced his name, they found it to be Barry George. The police knew that he had convictions for a sex attack in the 1980s and a strange event in which he turned up at a royal palace with a length of rope and a knife. His intentions were unclear. People in Fulham were aware of Barry George's reputation for living in an almost fantasy world where he took on different aliases and different names and believed he was related to different celebrities.
Here we go again. Somebody else showing up at the palace. Like we literally just spoke about this. So weird. And it's like, what were you going to do if you actually entered the palace? Like, that's really terrifying.
I know, with a length of rope and a knife. I don't know. It is scary. They began to look seriously at Barry George and his ability to have committed such a crime. At the time of learning his name, there wasn't much to connect him and Jill, aside from the fact that he lived only half a mile away. But could this be the man who'd murdered her? The police believed that he could be, and began to tail Barry George and investigate his life. As it would turn out, Barry George was not necessarily the man that they were looking for, but the lengths that the police went to try and establish his guilt has always been a huge part in the narrative of Jill's murder. Next time, we're going to look into the investigation into Barry George and what happened next in relation to Jill's murder.
Yeah, like where we're ending off here, I'm sure all of the listeners can see the incredible pressure that the investigators are under, I'm sure from the family, from the public, and the fact that they're focusing on Barry George and trying to make a narrative fit. It's unfortunately what happens all too often in crimes such as these.
Yeah. I think, it's the aftermath of kind of what happened when the police tried to make this fit is what has also made this case so infamous.
Absolutely. Well, that's where we're going to end part 1. So please come back and join us for part 2, which will be out shortly. Caprice, quickly, can you tell my listeners where to find you and your podcast on social media?
Yep, you can find the podcast on Twitter at The Unseen Pod, on Facebook at The Unseen Podcast, where I also have a discussion group, on Instagram at The Unseen Pod, and also at our channel on YouTube, where I also upload all my episodes.
Thank you for listening. If you want to reach out with feedback or just to say hi, you can do so on Twitter at Podcast Riddle. And you can also email me at riddlemethatpod@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, you can make a one-time PayPal donation to riddlemethatpod@gmail.com. I'm also on Buy Me a Coffee at all one word, Riddle Me That Pod. Watch out for my new show, The Path Went Chilly with Robin Warder and Dr. Ashley Wellman, where we discuss cases Robin has covered on The Trail Went Cold. We launch in early April, and until next time, stay safe and remember, accept nothing, question everything.